This is Transmission Interrupted, a podcast series from Nipah, the National Emerging Special Pathogens Training and Education Center. Welcome to Transmission Interrupted from Nipah.
Hello and welcome to Transmission Interrupted. My name is Jill Morgan. I'm a nurse here at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. For those of you not yet familiar with Nipah, our mission is to set the gold standard for special pathogen preparedness and response across health systems in the U.S., with the goals of driving best practices and closing knowledge gaps and developing innovative resources. Nipah works alongside and in cooperation with the CDC and is funded by ASPR, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. I am excited today to talk to two brilliant women who are going to help fill in the gaps. You know, I think about we're in the middle of a pretty bad flu season this year. Here at Emory, our emergency departments have been full with respiratory pathogen patients. Our ICUs, unfortunately, are full with people really suffering from influenza and other respiratory pathogens. I know the Children's Hospital here in Atlanta is also very full with these same kinds of things. I think we're all used to the idea that influenza has this seasonality to it, right? We talk about flu season. We get our vaccinations, I hope, in the fall to protect us for this flu season that seems to inevitably hit in the winter. And of course, the folks that are disease watchers, epidemiologists from across the world, watch this move from the southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere. And obviously, our seasons for those things are different. But it was amazing to me, and I suppose it makes me sound a little dim to say I hadn't really thought about the seasonality of other pathogens. And then we started, of course, diving into high consequence infectious diseases. As it turns out, there are a lot of things that have seasonality to them, even though that's not necessarily on our radar every day. So what we're going to talk about today are two special pathogens. Those are things that have either not great treatments or have a high morbidity mortality, or that might end up, at least in the US, in a biocontainment unit, and that really have this person-to-person spread. And so we're going to talk about the seasonality of some of these other high-consequence infectious diseases. So I'm really grateful for the generosity of these two folks. I have Dr. Susan McLellan, who's the director of SPECTRE, which is the best acronym ever, the Special Pathogens Excellence in Clinical Treatment, Readiness, and Education at UTMB in Galveston. And I have Dr. Lindsay Busch, who is an assistant professor of medicine in the Emory School of Medicine, and she's the associate medical director of Emory's Serious Communicable Diseases Unit, a much less jazzy acronym, SCDU, and she's critical care and infectious disease. So ladies, welcome. Thank you so much for your generosity being here today and sharing your expertise on these two kind of quirky seasonal pathogens. So, you know, the two pathogens we're going to talk about today really are Nipah and Lassa. So Lassa fever and Nipah virus, they're in different viral families, but we're going to talk about why they have seasonality and where do they come from? Why do they fluctuate the way they do? So I think maybe just starting with Nipah, this is a little less, I think, commonly known, probably affects, at least it has a potential to affect a lot of people, but we haven't seen quite as many big outbreaks, perhaps. So would love to dive into some of the details about Nipah virus and why there's a higher risk at certain times of the year. So Susan, you want to start out with just a little bit of that background? You have a fascinating history with all sorts of high consequence infectious diseases, but perhaps not so much just about Nipah specifically, but I'm grateful for you to share what you know about this.
Well, I'll throw it in because the Nipah story is really quite entertaining. And even from a clinician standpoint, which is mine primarily, figuring out why people get exposed, the work that's been done was really entertaining. So of interest, the very first outbreak was actually in Malaysia. And it was a very different outbreak than the one the recurrent outbreaks which have been occurring in Bangladesh and in India. That first outbreak was recognized eventually to be due to exposure to pigs who had gotten infected with Nipah virus. Malaysia is a part of the world where, in fact, there's significant pig production. And in these pig farms, there was what was thought to be a contamination of the areas that pigs were eating with fruit that had been contaminated by feces or urine from bats who were infected with Nipah. Now, the bats don't have a problem with the Nipah as far as we know, but if they leave their excreta on fruits and things which are not consumed, they can make other animals sick. Exactly which other animals across the board is not entirely known, but we certainly figured out at that time that pigs could become infected. Pigs make a lot of respiratory secretions when they have Nipah before they die. And these respiratory secretions are what transmit it. And it was transmitted to humans. And then some of these pigs got shipped to Singapore. And this was the very first outbreak. So it was the first the disease hadn't been recognized yet. And so once eventually it sort of got tracked down that we were dealing with a new infection with these manifestations, there was essentially no person-to-person transmission with this outbreak. It was all pig-to-person is what's thought. And
I don't mean to laugh because these people got sick, but you're right. I mean, pig to person is not a transmission I had really previously given much thought to.
Well, there you go. Pigs get runny noses when they get sick as well, just like humans. And just like humans, runny noses result in transmission.
Wow.
So, also the disease presentation that occurred in Malaysia was a little bit different, leaned towards a lot of encephalopathy and somewhat less respiratory symptoms. Now, the sort of potentially anthropologic reasons and so on why there might have been so little human-to-human transmission are really interesting as well. Perhaps the type of care that's provided in facilities in Malaysia and Singapore, but also the lesser amount of respiratory symptoms in humans may also have accounted for a decrease in human-to-human transmission. Now, the pattern that started showing up in Bangladesh was very different. This pattern, first of all, no pigs. These were areas where people do not consume pigs and are not farming pigs. And so the first question was, where is it coming from? And eventually it was determined again by Ben, had an idea of reservoirs, that these were these fruit bats types of bats, and that contamination from bat excreta is the issue. Turns out that there is a tradition of harvesting sap from palm trees in many parts of Southern Asia. And this was very prevalent in this area in Bangladesh, still is. And the way the sap is collected is to hang these pots on the trees and tap it, sort of like you get maple syrup. And you let the sap drain into these pots, and you leave the pots there overnight. And then the sap is used in production of these drinks. It's not cooked or pasteurized or anything like that, but it is used for a very popular drink. It turns out that bats like this sap as well. And the bats were coming to those pots and saying, oh, yum, let's have a drink. And the bats were drinking out of the pots. And while bats are hanging out drinking, they're maybe pooping a little bit, their saliva is getting into that kind of thing. So you end up with contaminated sap. Now, this was a real obvious phenomenon to a lot of people because the bats are doing this in the middle of the night when everyone is asleep. However, should you want to Google online bats and Nipah virus, there are some adorable pictures taken with infrared photography of these bats hanging out and drinking from the pots. And the bats are adorable. They're called fox bats because they have a face that looks like a cute little critter, and they've got big googly eyeballs. I mean, they're just adorable, but they do kind of carry some entertaining things. And so it was eventually recognized that this is how the sap was becoming contaminated.
All right. So I want to just say, I just want to give a shout out, first of all, to the disease detectives. Honestly, like you think about a new pathogen emerging, people are ending up with symptoms we can't explain. We can't find out what the source is. We don't know what these people have. And then they start looking, and this takes them from these humans. And I assume we have veterinarians who are also looking into sick pigs, but it takes them down this really complicated path to like somebody essentially having a wine bar for nocturnal bats on trees. I mean, it's just, it's an amazing story. And so I assume like this kind of gets us back into the whole, like bats might do this all the time where they're flying around and eating fruit. But when this particular coalescence happens, then you end up with contaminated bat spit. And really, if that's not the name of a band, I don't know what is.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff about the seasonality there that when I went down this deep rabbit hole. I think so the seasonality between when there's intermediate host driven outbreaks like in Malaysia and in Philippines, those outbreaks have an entirely different seasonality than the Bangladesh and India, where you're going direct, bat, sap, human, because essentially when you have a livestock associated outbreak, this is like, it's being communicated through a shared fruit source. And so essentially this is happening in seasons like spring and summer where the fruit trees are blooming. And so the bats are coming from their roost and they're feeding on the blooming fruit. And then they're dropping either the contaminated fruit or the seeds into the pigsty or, shared area where the horses are, for example. So, that's a spring summer phenomenon. That's what happened in Malaysia versus you have the opposite happening in the winter months in Bangladesh. And so that was where now the bats' food sources are not blooming. And that's what's really driving them to get into the sap as kind of their more preferred food source. But it was interesting what I was reading about is that they've done these virus studies and the bats don't actually change the amount of virus that they have. They carry the virus, year round. And
wow.
What's more interesting is it was kind of thought that because there might maybe more stress, they might be shedding more virus in the winter months. And the colder it is, the more they're driven to have more contact with these pots. So the colder it is, the more they visit, the more they contaminate the sap. And so that, increases the risk of transmission.
All right. So what you're saying, and this is revelatory to me, Lindsay, is that the bats have Nipah in them all the time, but it doesn't make them sick in any way. They're just like Nipah carriers at baseline.
Yep. Just happy with their Nipah.
Wow.
Sharing it, swapping it around the roosts.
But well.
This is a real example of the sort of One Health concept, which Lindsay is very, very familiar with, I'm sure. And although my primary role was being a clinical infectious disease doctor because of my interest over many years in diseases in unusual places, one has to sort of start to understand the interaction of human beings with the environment and with the other animals that are around us and how important that is to understanding disease transmission and why people get it one time or another. So that's certainly one. When we talk about some of the, talking at least about Lassa, we could throw in Marburg and Ebola, have some really entertaining sort of the same kind of conditions around them. But you really have to understand those intersections to understand when the risks exist.
Yeah, I think it's really, you're right. And I'm glad you brought up One Health because I think that's something that we probably need to emphasize even more when we're talking about high consequence infectious diseases. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think in Bangladesh, they are trying to have some interventions, like One Health based interventions around the sap trees. They're experimenting with different ways to shield the pots, and in addition to the surveillance and trying to figure out, is there a difference in the small roosts or bigger roosts and where the trees are located and all that kind of stuff. But I think they're trying to do some structural things as well to just reduce that interaction, as well as some cultural kind of education and trying to convince people that the raw vape pump sap is not safe for consumption, but there's a really strong perception that it is safe,
Yeah.
despite this being a yearly event of these outbreaks.
Right. Although it's a yearly event without huge numbers, right?
Correct. But pretty like devastating impact.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I'd like to, if we could sort of transition into, because I know, Susan, you mentioned this, like the encephalopathy. So of course, what we're talking about with that are people that might present with fever and altered mental status. And when we think about special pathogens, I think people sort of get caught up in the ones that maybe made the most news years ago. So the Ebola and Marburg, where you have, at least in people's minds, this image of people bleeding from everywhere, which we know is not true. But if you're going to call something a viral hemorrhagic fever, it seems like that would at least be what's going on. But in Nipah, this idea that people would come in altered with a fever, and to be clear, like, you can be altered just with a fever, right? But these people are really ill. Tell us more about like what the disease itself of Nipah looks like in a human. And let's set aside, I know that it apparently made for a lot of pig snot. Let's set that aside and just talk about what it looks like in humans in this case.
Well, once again, especially if you're going to talk about snot, it depends on whether you're talking about Malaysia or Bangladesh. And there are in fact separate strains, and they are referred to differently. They are referred to, one is the Bangladesh, the Nipah, Bangladesh, and Nipah, Malaysia. And the reason for that is the diseases are presented in Malaysia. Really, as I said, there was a lot of recognition. Well, the encephalopathy happens with, and that is important. But in Malaysia, there was often very little respiratory component, or that was not nearly as notable. Some patients did have significant respiratory disease with secretions and things like that, but the encephalopathy was really what was predominant. And when I say encephalopathy, these people would come in with a fever, altered mental status, and sometimes in a relatively rapid progression, then develop quite severe neurological deficits, seizures, and in terminal cases eventually become comatose and die. With the Bangladeshi variant, the same could occur, but was much more likely to be accompanied by respiratory symptoms, and the respiratory component could be the fatal event. And so those individuals, besides having much more significant respiratory disease, very much like the original SARS kind of picture, also had the neurological picture. And so kind of a different setup. This ends up being really important as to some of the issues around human-to-human transmission. Basically, the more snot you got, the easier it is to transmit. Right? You can sort of imagine that, right? Somebody that's coughing, somebody that has secretions coming out, and things like that, all of which have virus in them, are people who are going from whom transmission is more likely to occur. The other part is an interesting anthropological aspect, and this is, so anthropology, as a little bit separate from One Health, certainly associated with it, is another one of the sort of social sciences that we really need to involve to understand some of what's going on. In Bangladesh, much of the provision of care of a patient who's admitted to the hospital is provided by family members. So your mother, wife, whatever, is the person sitting by your bedside, wiping away the secretions and doing all of what we would think of as nursing care that would be done by healthcare professionals in a different setting. In Malaysia and in Singapore, the tradition or the practices are different in the hospital. So most of that kind of intimate care is being delivered by healthcare professionals with the use of PPE and so on. So that may account for some of the significantly higher rates of person-to-person transmission that we see, including in healthcare settings in Bangladesh versus Malaysia and Singapore. And India's kind of in between. India, their has been very little human-to-human transmission clearly documented compared to Bangladesh. Very, very hard to really parse that out, but that's at least something that's been recognized as a difference in the way care is provided that could be associated with the rates of transmission as opposed to it being just dependent on the virus.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. All right. So, Lindsay, any last minute things about Nipah? Because I know I think there's even more to talk about with Lassa. So I don't want to shortchange our Lassa conversation, but I want to give you a chance to say anything else you might want to about Nipah before we launch into that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can think of that we didn't touch on that's a little bit wild is, this is a hugely, highly morbid disease. We've kind of covered that people get this really dramatic decline and end in death. But what's really interesting to me is the case fatality rates that have been seen across the outbreaks have been really dramatic range. And I think what's interesting is starting the largest outbreak by far was the initial Malaysian outbreak when they were actually making the discovery of the virus. And interestingly, that one actually has the lowest case fatality rate. That one historically was, in the low 40s, like 40, 42, something like that. As we've seen other outbreaks occur, they've gotten as high as 80% case fatality rates. So while the Malaysian outbreak was tragic and had, a lot of loss of life and a lot of morbidity to it, and actually had a huge economic impact on Malaysia's industry, for decades to come, there could have been a lot more mortality. And I think that's something that isn't fully understood about the virus itself, is why we've seen such widely discrepant mortality in these different outbreaks.
I'll just throw in also traditions in those areas, their resource background and the utilization of medical services are different. And also their surveillance, their ability to recognize cases that are not as grave and may not be recognized as cases. And so that's going to affect your case fatality rate too. All of those make it really difficult to really parse out, is the case fatality rate worse because the rate of fatality among all people who get it, or is it among all people that we recognize as having gotten it?
No, I think it's an excellent point for us to keep in mind, because that's certainly true for many, many of our high consequence infectious diseases, is that we really only have data for those people who get sick enough and can get to a healthcare facility and get tested. And then, we can count those numbers in the cases in order to make a case fatality rate. And with some pathogens that might have diseases that might cause fewer symptoms or mild cases, we probably don't have good numbers for that. But it is fascinating to think that, the difference between 40 and 80, a 40% case fatality rate for a pathogen in the United States right now would be, that's a huge number. And yet it's, obviously it's only half of what ended up being in some of the other outbreaks. So certainly something we would want people to think about if you have people who are traveling from areas that might be affected by Nipah. So we've talked about Malaysia and Bangladesh and parts of India, not all of India, please. It's an enormous country, but thinking about exposure to date palm sap, thinking about exposure to bats and pigs, pig farms. If you have a patient that is got something you can't explain, think about these things. We really want people to keep some of these zebra-like pathogens in the back of their mind. So thanks. That was really, Susan, you absolutely promised something bizarre and interesting, and it absolutely was. And on the heels of that, let's launch into Lassa fever. And I just want to start by saying, like, the area that Lassa fever covers is enormous and incredibly densely populated. So the number of people at risk for this is just very, very high. So it is actually endemic in a bunch of areas that have huge populations, Sierra Leone and Liberia and Nigeria. That's millions upon millions upon millions of people. So this is, again, we just had folks traveling home for the holidays. You might have people visiting from these regions and really thinking about, when is Lassa season? And why is there a Lassa season? So again, ladies, inform me.
So Lassa fever is one of these ones that one of my favorite little presentations that takes a look at Lassa fever and a couple of the other viral hemorrhagic fevers from the viewpoint of the clinician versus the viewpoint of the One Health person or the environmental person or the surveillance person who's trying to figure out what's going on with it. To a clinician, Lassa, Marburg, Ebola, they all look very much the same, okay? And the way that we respond to them as far as supportive care, et cetera, very much the same. There's differences in what therapeutics we've developed, but really, they look the same. They walk, talk, quack the same with some minor variations. However, in terms of how they get around from person to person and their distribution, they're very, very different. So Lassa fever is carried by these adorable little mice called mastomus. There's probably a few other species that can carry them now and then, but those are really thought to be the ones. And they're mice versus rats. They're kind of intermediate size of what I think of as our common mouse and our common rat. I've first heard people call them both rats and mice, whatever. Mastomus, we all know what we're talking about. They're adorable. They live in particular in the brush surrounding rural areas, Nigeria or other parts of West Asia, Sierra Leone, all the areas that got hit by Ebola there. And they have a seasonality as well as to both their behavior and also their reproduction all tied together. And Lindsay can probably give you more specifics on that timing of reproduction and things like that. But anyway, so what happens is these mice, they're out there running around. When there's plenty of food around, so there's enough rain, et cetera, and so on, they're getting fed up happily outside of the human habitations. And so humans are less exposed because they're not just running around the human habitations. Now, how do they transmit from the human habitations? Well, just like the bats, they pee and they poop. Basically, their excreta ends up in the human habitations. And the contact is often aerosolization. In other words, urine dries and then you go sweeping the floor of your hut and it aerosolizes. We can breathe it in, as well as other ways that you can get infected. So as the season becomes drier, as food becomes less available, these rodents then move closer to hanging out around the human habitations where people are storing food. And again, these are habitations that are not like seal tight, like one of our air-conditioned houses where you don't want anything getting in or out. They often may be made of types of building products which can easily have some crumbling, some clay, things like that, so the small rodents can get in and out, et cetera, and so on. That's the focus of trying to educate communities to do that. But quite honestly, having just a few months ago been in one of those areas, you can have a community that's pretty well educated that it's good to keep the rodents away from your food supply, except that you're drawing things out on an open area. And yeah, well, okay, yes, once we finish drying that, we'll put it away in somewhere that's more locked up or so on. Food storage often occurs in people's homes because of security issues, of concerns about thievery in the community and such, as well as just convenience. So for a lot of reasons, there continues to be human exposure to these secretions and things like that. So people become infected that way. And the seasonality is related to the seasonality of food availability. And also, once they've been through a time of lots of food availability, well, that's when you make a lot of new mice, okay? And so the population has also exploded during this time of high amount of food availability. And then you're driving all your new juveniles, whatever you want to call them, into the areas of human areas where they can access food and things like that. And these mastitis, by the way, they can make babies like mad. You know, you look at your dogs and cats on their bellies and see the number of nipples, and maybe the vet can tell me there's six nipples. I forget. But anyway, these guys have like 20. I mean, you got two big stripes of nipples on the bellies of these guys, and that means that's the kind of a litter that they produce. So when they make a bunch of baby mice, they make a bunch of baby mice. So the populations really explode.
Things I had never considered before. One, the number of nipples on a mouse, just full stop, had never occurred to my brain whatsoever. But we're now like in the middle of this dry season in this area. So November to March would be the dry season for this swath of West Africa, which means that this is when, depending, of course, on the what exactly is going on with the rodents in the area, but basically that's driving the mice indoors to seek food, to have babies, and to potentially carry Lassa to humans. Now, is there Lassa in mice all the time? Does it make mice sick?
Yes and no. Yes, it's in mice all the time. No, it doesn't appear to cause pathology.
Good grief. So here we have all these healthy mice out having cajillions of babies, spreading Lassa without it giving them a second thought. And here people are trying to do the right thing, store food, clean up after any mess, sweeping things up, and aerosolizing dried rodent excrement, inhaling it and getting sick.
Although, I mean, even without the sweeping and then in the indoor excrement, there's other human behaviors that can bring people into close proximity to the virus. So, I mean, there's been a lot of epidemiologic studies that talk about this. The condition of the housing. Obviously, you have to. There's certainly concern for any housing that has a non-sealed floor where the mice can get in more easily. That troops, those types of things. But also populations or persons that are using the mice as a food source. There are people that do that, and even hunting and trapping of other animals. So this is like the primary reservoir, but there has been Lassa identified in other animals that can be another source that they could pick up the Lassa from. And then just farming itself, again, because you're around all of the dust, even if it's an outdoor exposure as opposed to you sweeping up indoors, you can be exposed outdoor. So I think in a lot of the Nigerian epidemiological studies, farming as an occupation is seen as one of the biggest risk factors for coming out with Lassa fever.
Sure. And that makes complete sense because, of course, that's where our grains are coming from and somebody's growing them. And that means that somebody's threshing things and collecting stuff. And all of that is producing a lot of aerosolization of whatever's there in the soil. So, yeah, that does make sense. I had not thought about farming as a risk factor.
Yeah. But this is obviously an area where there's not like a Publix on the corner. So, this is a way of life. And this is what needs to be done to sustain. So.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, because we did mention that there's this huge population that's at risk of Lassa. We're in the United States, we're emergency doctors, we're infectious disease physicians, as y'all are. What do we want people to watch for? What do we want people to ask, look for, to early identify these patients before we can have person-to-person spread in a hospital setting or in their family setting?
So I think the biggest thing I think most hospitals and facilities and providers are familiar with travel screens. So having a general idea of the geography of where these outbreaks are happening in the world is helpful. But I think we need to be much more granular than that. And I think that's where, Susan, I don't know if you take these phone calls like we do at Emory, but if there's ever concern for a special pathogen, we have a 24/7 consult line. And so we get these phone calls that say, I'm worried about Ebola, I'm worried about Marburg. And so just because somebody is coming from Nigeria with a fever does not mean that they have Lassa fever or Ebola, right? There are many, many, many things that are more common than that. And so I think really encouraging our staff to get really granular and specific with their travel screen. So we really need to know where exactly in country you were, what activities were you doing? Were you on things such as malaria prophylaxis? Were you around people that were sick? Was their illness diagnosed as something? And I think especially in areas where there are kind of cultural implications for some of these things, One of the things that's really interesting, I love that Susan's brought up a lot of the anthropology. I was an anthropology major in college, so it always makes my heart sing to talk about those things. But one of the things that's really interesting as I link for Lassa that I've read about is kind of people coming from the U.S. going home to visit family in Africa, and often for funerals. And there can be different kind of burial traditions and funeral service traditions there that can increase risk for transmission of Lassa fever. And so really talking to people about where were you, what were you doing, what was going on around you means much more than just were you in Africa? Check.
So that's incredibly important. It's not just anybody from Nigeria, right? If you've only been in an urban setting, if you haven't been going to communities where there's possible exposure to this, not engaging in any activities or so on that would put you at risk, either from exposure to environmental transmission or human-to-human transmission, such as occurs with the burials that Lindsay was talking about, your risk is much, much lower. Now, another thing I just want to point out about Lassa, because as I said, the clinicians tend to think they're all the same. And at the point where you've got a caretaker or a burial attendant working with the human body of a human patient, they are very, very much the same. However, once again, a huge difference in sort of transmission and transmission rates, and also in frequency of severe disease. With Ebola, we tend to think about it as one of these ones where if you get 10 virus particles in you, you are going to have a case of Ebola. Not everybody is going to die, but the vast majority of people are going to be symptomatic, and many of those cases are going to be severe. That is not at all the case with Lassa, where it's more of a ratio of 1 to 200. So many people are infected with Lassa, and this we know by serostudies and so on. And many of them have completely unrecognized disease or no disease. So your chance of getting severe disease, if you encounter a couple of virus particles of Lassa, seems to be much lower than your chance of getting disease if you encounter a couple of virus particles of Ebola. And the other thing that I don't want to leave out is that Lassa is actually not one disease. We have at least seven strains. They're not referred to as serotypes because they really are different, probably to some extent in their activity and their genetics. And the problem with that is it really complicates both our diagnostics and our development of therapeutics, because the targets are not the same on all these strains, even though we call them all Lassa fever.
Yeah. Phylogeographic lineages.
Thank you.
That was the first time I was reading that, and I was like, that's a new one for me.
I read it. I just didn't memorize it.
Yeah. And for people who are here in the United States who might be encountering somebody with the travel history, yours is not to worry about which one of the 7 strains of Lassa it might be, but recognizing travel, recognizing symptoms, thinking early that this might be something that isn't malaria, although we know statistically it will be malaria. Having that in your head is important. And it does affect, as Dr. McLellan just mentioned, tests for these things is more difficult the more variations there are within these viral families. So I think it's important, because sometimes people will say, well, if Lassa is this widespread, or if Nipah could infect this many people, why don't we have more rapid testing and more therapeutics? Well, because some of these things are new, some of these things don't occur very often in high resource settings, and then things like Lassa that have all these variabilities to them make that a real challenge. So, ladies, I want to give you an opportunity to make any last statements about the seasonality of Nipah or Lassa. And I also just want to thank you so much I feel like my mind's been blown today by all sorts of information about pig farms and
mouse
sap
nipples
from trees and mouse nipples. And I'm not sure I can recover from this. So any last statements? Susan?
Well, I'll give that plug again for two things. One, the concepts behind One Health and the use of anthropology and understanding these diseases are phenomenally important. The second thing I'll give is just a more specific to throw in for those who prepare travelers for travel or who have influence on travelers who travel. And it's a more specific thing, specifically in malaria prevention or prevention of other diseases that might make you sick while you travel. You really don't want to get held up at a border or in some ambulance at a hospital where they won't let you in the door because they're afraid you might have a viral hemorrhagic fever, when in fact, all you've got is malaria because you heard malaria wasn't so bad and it's easy to treat and who cares or whatever. Those sentiments are all very wrong just about malaria, but they're even worse if they throw you into the pit of being evaluated for a high consequence infection.
I'm very glad you said all that. That's great. Lindsay?
I think the only other thing, I had kind of a fun little thought exercise when I was going down my Nipah rabbit hole about how potential effects of climate change on the seasonality of all these things. And I was thinking about how it's interesting that between like the Bangladeshi Nipah seasonality and Lassa, you can imagine that climate change could have opposite effects there. And perhaps as climate is warming, you may actually see less Nipah in Bangladesh if the bats are kind of driven to the sap less. Whereas if things continue to warm, you would imagine drier, more arid conditions in the kind of Lassa belt of Africa and potentially more brush fires and things. So, just throwing another variable into an already complex scenario that I like to do.
Yeah, no, it really is. I think that's what infectious disease docs do, but I'm grateful. And it is a lot to think about. These are complex. One Health, it's not just a butterfly batting its wings here and something happening on the other side of the world. It's that all of these things are interrelated on every level.
One of the only ways that we can know about, therefore respond to, prevent, negotiate outbreaks of severe infectious diseases is by having highly active surveillance programs in the places where these diseases are endemic. This is a matter of policy that has been hugely influenced over changes in the last 12 months in funding and in priorities for research. There has been previously a very important program in surveillance for emerging infectious diseases overseas, led by NIH with multiple partners around the world. The funding for that has been withdrawn. These are very important activities that, although they seem to be directed towards what's going on somewhere else that's not our problem, obviously it is our problem. These diseases come to us no matter how much we want to hide. And the best way to be prepared not to have them affect the U.S. population is to have a good understanding of what's happening in other populations, because they are all interrelated.
Yep, absolutely. We are certainly a part of the larger world, and for better most of the time. And sometimes those things put us at risk, just as we put other people at risk when we carry, whatever we have to other places, whether that's our influenza, as we sit in the middle of flu season, or something else. So, ladies, thank you so much. Such a pleasure. I really am grateful for your attention. Also grateful for your patience in putting all this stuff together. So thank you guys very much. If you're listening to this podcast for the first time, we hope you'll join us again for other episodes of Transmission Interrupted. And if you have ideas for future shows or questions about today's show or anything else, you can contact us at info@netech.org. You can find us on the web at netec.org/podcast. You can subscribe to future episodes and find all sorts of information. And we'll see you next time on Transmission Interrupted.
You've been listening to Transmission Interrupted, a NETEC podcast, produced and edited by Benjamin Madsen, with additional support provided by Britton Clark, Veronica Lavaro, Jason Noble, and Lisa Stone. Special thanks to our guests and the subject matter experts at NETEC for their insight and guidance. This podcast is supported by the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. For more information, tools, and training on special pathogen preparedness, visit netec.org. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for tuning in to Transmission Interrupted.